According to the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, food waste constitutes nearly 30% of all the trash that ends up in landfills, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions as it breaks down. It's a staggering figure, especially when you consider that much of this waste could be turned into valuable compost. Statistics show that an average family can generate over 400 pounds of kitchen waste per year, and yet, many people, like me, struggle with turning their kitchen scraps into something beneficial for the environment and their gardens. Composting, while touted as easy and eco-friendly, can feel overwhelming when life gets busy or the process doesn't seem to work. This was my experience, one that left me frustrated and full of self-doubt. My name is Lisa, and I'm 37 years old. I grew up with a love for the earth, always feeling drawn to the idea of self-sustainability. But somehow, composting became my personal failure. It sounds dramatic, I know, but when you care about the planet and want to do your part, falling short feels like more than just a small mistake. It feels like a fundamental flaw. I started with the best of intentions. I had read the statistics about food waste and knew I wanted to make a difference in my own way. Composting seemed like the perfect solution. I began collecting my kitchen scraps, banana peels, coffee grounds, eggshells, vegetable clippings, everything organic went into my bin. I was excited. I imagined rich, dark compost that would nourish my garden, full of nutrients for my flowers and vegetables. But that's not what happened. In the beginning, I made a few mistakes I didn't realize at the time. I tossed in things I thought were compostable, only to later find out they weren't. I didn't understand the balance between greens and browns. I thought, if it's food, it'll break down, right? Wrong. My compost pile quickly turned into a foul-smelling mess. Instead of the earthy aroma I was expecting, it reeked. My neighbors started complaining, and I became embarrassed. What had started as a hopeful, environmentally conscious project had quickly devolved into a disaster I didn't know how to fix. But the smell wasn't even the worst part. After weeks of waiting, all I had was a soggy, fly-ridden pile of rot. I had read so many stories about successful composting, how it was supposed to be black gold for your garden. But mine? It was a stinking mound of failure. I felt defeated every time I went to check the bin. Why wasn't it working? What was I doing wrong? I started to dread even thinking about composting. I'd procrastinate, avoiding the pile for days, even weeks at a time. I'd still put my kitchen scraps aside, but I knew in the back of my mind that they weren't going to turn into anything useful. I was just delaying the inevitable. That pile was never going to be compost, and I was never going to be the kind of person who could make it work. I'd read articles and watch videos of people who seemed to have it all figured out. They made it look so simple. Why couldn't I get the balance right? Why couldn't I turn my kitchen scraps into something more than a gross heap of rotting food? The turning point came during a particularly hot summer. The heat amplified the stench coming from my backyard. It was unbearable. The smell wafted into the house, and I found myself almost gagging every time I stepped outside. My garden, which I had hoped to enrich with homemade compost, was suffering. The plants were wilting in the heat, and the compost, which was supposed to be my solution, had become my biggest source of stress. I couldn't stand it anymore. One day, I stood in front of the pile, holding a bag of fresh kitchen scraps, and just broke down. Tears welled up in my eyes as I stared at the mess in front of me. All I wanted was to contribute something positive to the earth, to feel like I was making a difference in some small way. But instead, I felt like I was failing the environment, failing my garden, failing myself. I tried to be green, but all I'd managed to do was create more waste. The guilt was overwhelming. Every time I threw another banana peel or coffee filter into the bin, I felt like I was adding to my personal pile of inadequacy. I'd go online and see pictures of other people's successful composting projects, lush gardens, healthy soil, and perfectly balanced compost heaps. It seemed like everyone else had figured it out but me. I'd invested time, energy, and hope into this project, and it felt like all of it had been for nothing. I started to question my ability to do anything right. Was it really so hard? Was I just not cut out for this? I had grown up with a love for nature, yet I couldn't even manage to compost a few kitchen scraps. Every failure chipped away at my confidence, and soon, I wasn't just doubting my ability to compost, I was doubting myself in other areas of my life too. The compost bin, once a symbol of my eco-conscious ambitions, had become a constant reminder of my inadequacies. I felt like a fraud, pretending to care about the environment while failing at one of the simplest ways to make a difference. I avoided the pile, hoping it would magically fix itself, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't. It was like watching a dream crumble, bit by bit, day after day. Even more painful was the fact that I couldn't just walk away from it. It wasn't like I could quit composting without feeling like I'd given up on something bigger than myself. I was torn between wanting to make it work and feeling completely incapable of doing so. It was a vicious cycle. The more I failed, the more discouraged I became, and the less motivated I was to keep trying. Friends would come over and ask about my garden, and I'd change the subject. I couldn't bear to admit that my grand plans for composting had completely fallen apart. It wasn't just about the pile in the backyard anymore, it was about the growing sense of failure that I couldn't shake. Composting had become more than just an activity, it was a test of my ability to follow through on something important, and I was failing that test miserably. I had always prided myself on being someone who cared about the earth, someone who wanted to make a difference. But now, I felt like a hypocrite. My attempts at composting had only created more problems, and I was left feeling defeated and embarrassed. I thought I could handle this, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this after all. The smell, the frustration, the mounting sense of failure, it all became too much. I started to resent the very thing I once felt so passionate about. Composting wasn't just a hobby gone wrong, it was a constant reminder of my shortcomings, a burden I couldn't seem to shake. And yet, despite all of this, something deep inside me wouldn't let go. At my lowest point, I stood over that foul-smelling pile, unsure of how to proceed. I knew something had to change, but I didn't know where to start. I couldn't keep avoiding the problem, it was literally rotting in my backyard. One day, after another long bout of frustration, I decided to take a different approach. I stopped seeing composting as this huge, overwhelming task and started breaking it down into smaller, more manageable steps. That's when things began to shift for me. The first thing I did was educate myself, something I hadn't really done before. Up until then, I had been winging it, assuming that composting was as simple as throwing food scraps in a bin. I realized how wrong I had been. I began by learning about the basic components of compost, carbon and nitrogen, or as many people call it, browns and greens. I needed to understand how to create the right balance. Without that balance, composting is doomed from the start. The more I read, the more I understood how crucial it was to have the right ratio of dry materials like leaves, cardboard, and paper, which provide carbon, and moist, green materials like fruit peels and vegetable scraps, which provide nitrogen. With this newfound understanding, I took action. I stopped mindlessly dumping kitchen scraps into the bin. Instead, I began collecting dry leaves and small twigs to layer between the food waste. Each time I added a batch of scraps, I'd sprinkle some browns on top, maintaining a balance. It was a small change, but almost immediately, things started to improve. The smell? It wasn't gone completely, but it was definitely less intense. And that felt like progress. Then came the next step, turning the pile. I had no idea how important aeration was in the composting process. As it turns out, compost needs oxygen to break down properly. Without turning the pile and allowing air to circulate, it was no wonder my compost had become a stinky, slimy mess. I set a goal to turn the pile at least once a week. The first time I did it, I was overwhelmed by how much the pile had changed. Instead of the soupy, wet mix I had been dreading, I found drier layers underneath. That was a huge relief. It gave me the confidence I needed to keep going. Of course, the journey wasn't without setbacks. There were still days when I'd check the bin and feel like things weren't moving fast enough. I was impatient, expecting instant results, but composting takes time. It's a slow process, and learning to be patient was one of the hardest lessons. There were moments when I felt tempted to give up again, but I kept reminding myself that change doesn't happen overnight. What also helped was joining a local composting community online. I started asking questions, getting advice from people who had been composting for years. I wasn't alone in my struggles, and that gave me a sense of comfort. People shared their own experiences, offering tips and encouragement. I learned that composting isn't a perfect science. It's okay to make mistakes as long as you're willing to learn from them. That sense of community support made a huge difference in my motivation. I also began keeping a composting journal. I know it sounds a bit obsessive, but it was a game changer. Every time I added to the pile, I'd jot down what I was adding and how it affected the balance. Was the pile too wet? Too dry? Did it need more carbon or nitrogen? Tracking my progress gave me insights I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. I started to see patterns and recognize what my pile needed without relying on guesswork. Composting became less of a burden and more of an experiment, one that I was getting better at with each passing week. Slowly, the transformation started. What once was a foul-smelling disaster began to take on the appearance of rich, dark compost. The stench was gone, replaced by a fresh, earthy aroma that filled me with pride every time I turned the pile. I can't describe the satisfaction I felt when I spread that first batch of homemade compost on my garden beds. It was tangible proof that all my hard work had paid off. And the difference in my plants? It was remarkable. They grew faster, fuller, and more vibrant than ever before. Through trial and error, I had finally mastered the art of composting, or at least, I had gotten much better at it. It wasn't an overnight success, but I learned that persistence and a willingness to adapt were key to overcoming my failures. Composting, like any skill, takes time to develop, but once you get the hang of it, it's incredibly rewarding. And while all of this progress was happening, I came across a resource that truly helped me get over the final hurdles: Compost King/Queen, Turn Kitchen Scraps into Garden Gold. This book was a game changer for me. It broke down the composting process in such an accessible way, with clear, step-by-step instructions that even someone like me, who had struggled so much, could follow. What I loved most about it was how practical the advice was. It didn't just tell me what to do, but explained why each step was necessary. It covered everything from balancing greens and browns, to troubleshooting issues like odor and pests, to tips for speeding up the decomposition process. The book also offered insights into different composting methods I hadn't even considered, like vermicomposting and bokashi, which opened my eyes to new ways I could improve my system. With the guidance from Compost King/Queen, I was able to take my composting to a whole new level. If you're feeling stuck like I was, I can't recommend it enough. You can grab your digital copy at libriffy.com, link in the description. Trust me, if you're struggling with composting or even just starting out, this book is the solution you've been looking for. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more helpful tips, and if this story resonated with you, please like and share the content. It could help someone else struggling on their composting journey.